Hey YouTube, on today's episode of the Horror Boost podcast, we're going to talk about what Siskel and Ebert thought of horror movies. Now, Siskel and Ebert actually have a reputation for not really liking a lot of movies in the horror genre. This mostly comes from their dislike of slasher movies like Friday the 13th. They criticized the violence as being gratuitous and said that those kinds of movies are just about teenagers getting hacked to pieces. Gene Siskel in particular really railed against the first Friday the 13th movie. He publicly shamed the producers on air and said that everyone involved with the picture should be ashamed of themselves, including actress Betsy Palmer, who most of us know as Mrs. Voorhees in the first movie. Gene Siskel also did some short specials where he criticized Silent Night, Deadly Night, and Maniac. Siskel and Ebert were really taken aback by the trend of slasher movies that seemed to be ubiquitous in the horror genre. The irony is that these slasher movies were made because of the success of Halloween, a movie that both Siskel and Ebert praised on their show for its use of suspense. In his written review of Halloween, Roger Ebert gave the film 4 out of 4 stars, a rare perfect rating. So maybe it wasn't necessarily the slasher genre that they took issue with, but rather how it was being used. After all, Halloween is a lot more tame than the Friday the 13th films. There is far less blood and gore than you see in Halloween as compared to other slasher movies of its time. Gene Siskel would often comment that a lot of the violent scenes would involve victims who were women. This was a very common criticism of the slasher genre. But defenders of the genre will often point out that there's usually a final girl who survives, a character who tends to be the most crafty and does outsmart the killer. But some film critics have pointed out that the final girl is usually allowed to survive because she abstains from sex and doesn't do drugs. In essence, she is a quote-unquote good girl and is therefore allowed to live. But Siskel and Ebert didn't usually debate whether a final girl was an empowering character to have in a horror movie. Their critiques of the slasher genre often didn't get a chance to get that far, because they would dismiss the film as being morally reprehensible, shameless, etc. But to be fair to them, a 20-minute TV show doesn't really give you enough time to delve into these criticisms, especially when they spend on average 4 to 5 minutes talking about one movie. Some of their views of the slasher genre did change over the years. Gene Siskel said that he liked Jason Lives or Friday the 13th Part 6 better than the other installments in the franchise. This is because it was noticeably less violent and more silly than the other movies. He said that Jason Lives was a refreshing departure from the other films because it treated Jason with more humor. Roger Ebert also came around to the genre and gave a positive review to the movie Scream in 1996. On their show, Roger Ebert defended the movie and said that it was smarter than your typical slasher film. But Gene Siskel still criticized the movie as being too violent and too bloody and unenjoyable to sit through. But what's more puzzling is that a year later when Scream 2 came out, they both gave that film a positive review. Scream 2 is noticeably more violent than Scream 1, but Gene Siskel liked it better and praised the writing of the characters. So it wasn't always super clear whether or not they would like or dislike a slasher movie. Some horror movie fans have called this hypocrisy on their part, because why defend a movie like Scream 2 and then trash a movie like A Nightmare on Elm Street 3? And why praise Scream 2 for its writing while dismissing Scream 1? It seems to be the lack of consistency in their reviews that most people take issue with. But I want to be fair to them because they did give some positive reviews to some classic horror movies. For example, Gene Siskel did praise The Thing in 1982, and other critics of the time were not as enthusiastic about it. Gene Siskel said that he admired the real sense of paranoia that movie develops. Roger Ebert, though, wasn't really a fan of The Thing. So for those who say that Gene Siskel was harder on horror movies than Roger Ebert, I'm not so sure that that's true. They seem to have a different taste in the kinds of horror movies that they liked. Roger Ebert gave a positive review to Wes Craven's Last House on the Left, even though Gene Siskel did not like that movie at all. But they both gave two enthusiastic thumbs up for Dawn of the Dead in 1978, a movie that's arguably much more violent than some of the other films I just mentioned. But this goes back to how the violence is used and in what context. They said that Dawn of the Dead is a great commentary on American consumerism, with the zombies aimlessly wandering the shopping mall while the world around them falls apart. Earlier I mentioned how Siskel and Ebert took issue with the way that slasher movies portrayed women, but Roger Ebert notably gave a thumbs down to Blue Velvet because of the way that Isabel Rossellini's character was treated. But this is the same guy who gave a positive review to Last House on the Left. Go figure. When it came to horror movies, the films that Siskel and Ebert tended to like more were some of the more light-hearted horror movies. Roger Ebert liked Fright Night, Return of the Living Dead, and Evil Dead 2. Gene Siskel liked An American Werewolf in London and Shocker. They both seem to enjoy a lot of the PG-13 killer animal type movies. They both gave a thumbs up to Anaconda and Arachnophobia. They also praised Jaws, as most critics do, because after all, Jaws is the gold standard for killer animal movies. But one of their more famous blunders of film criticism was their unenthusiastic review of Jurassic Park, which they criticized as not having enough of a sense of wonder for the dinosaurs that have just come back to Earth. They only gave it a marginal thumbs up at the time, which looking back is kind of unbelievable considering the legacy it has now. Another example of one of their worst reviews is The Silence of the Lambs, which Gene Siskel called, and I quote, trashy. Now, even though I vehemently disagree with a lot of their takes on these different movies, I love it when one of them dislikes a movie and then the other one has this great platform to defend it. In the case of Silence of the Lambs, Roger Ebert was quick to respond that the performances were brilliant and called the art direction and music very effective. But interestingly enough, they both gave very good reviews to Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer. It's really hard to gauge what they would like or dislike. They both gave thumbs down to Psycho 2, but Roger Ebert gave Psycho 3 a thumbs up. Gene Siskel liked A Clockwork Orange and Roger Ebert didn't. Roger Ebert liked Aliens and Gene Siskel didn't. It's a little hard to say which one of them was the better film critic. Whether or not you like a movie is going to be really subjective, and it might even change over the years. When The Shining was released in 1980, it received mixed reviews and even won a few Razzie Awards. Now it's widely considered to be one of the best horror movies ever made. A lot of critics disliked Psycho when it was first released, and they called it a gimmick movie. I guess what I'm saying is that Siskel and Ebert weren't the only ones to get it wrong at the time. But because they had what was arguably the biggest platform for film criticism, they naturally received a lot of backlash from viewers and even some directors. Notably, Roland Emmerich, who included a parody of Siskel and Ebert in his 1998 film Godzilla, a movie that they later called one of the very worst of the year. But when they did find a horror movie that they both enjoyed, they were very excited about it on their show, oftentimes naming it their video pick of the week, as they did with The Fly and Evil Dead 2. I guess they knew that a lot of people who went to the video store in the 80s and 90s might like to rent a scary movie. They seem to be very fond of the horror movies that focus a lot on character development. In their 1983 review of Christine, they talked about how they related to the character of Arnie, who was so obsessed with his new car, and they remembered what it was like to have a car at that age. In their review of Misery, they focused on what a creepy character Annie Wilkes was. In a sense, it seems like they gravitated towards stories that had characters that seemed like they could be real people. So maybe the slasher genre was just too simplistic for them. But their vilification of the slasher genre is what earned them a reputation for hating horror movies, even though they certainly didn't hate all horror movies, and they didn't even hate all slasher movies. It could also be that a lot of their negative reviews just stemmed from the fact that the slasher movies were so popular in the early 80s. It seemed like that was the most common type of horror movie in that era. They would regularly name a slasher movie like New Year's Evil as one of their dogs of the week. So maybe they just got tired of seeing that specific kind of horror movie so often. I also wonder if they became aware of their reputation for hating horror films, which is why in their later years they decided to loosen up how they felt about them. Many people were surprised to find Roger Ebert enjoy Rob Zombie's The Devil's Rejects, a movie that he might not have been so kind to in the early 1980s. I think it's interesting how these critics' perspectives can change over time. It might also have to do with current affairs and the state of the world. The horror genre is one of the very best at giving us a scathing social commentary, and I think those are the kinds of horror movies that Siskel and Ebert seem to like the best. Roger Ebert gave 4 out of 4 stars to Abel Ferrara's Body Snatchers in 1993. A movie that not all critics loved at the time. He said that it deserves the highest praise that you can give to a horror movie. It works. So maybe that's what it came down to. Did the horror movie scare them or not? Does a horror movie have to scare you to be a good horror movie? And what is it that makes a horror movie scary? And is it enough to be scary, or does it have to have some redeeming value? I don't know the answer to that. But I am glad that we have so many of their reviews of horror movies to discuss and debate, even if they might make us angry or confused. If nothing else, at least it gets a conversation going. The truth is that I wouldn't even have known about a lot of horror movies if it wasn't for Siskel and Ebert reviewing them on their show. That's what makes it so ironic, because even if they didn't like a lot of those horror movies, they still drew a lot of attention to them.